So welcome back to section 2 or part 2 of our SQL seminar. In the first section, I sort of gave you an overview of SQL, how things work, how things are organized, what is SQL, what is the utility of SQL, databases, and so forth. In this section, this is a much shorter section, but in this section, I'm going to talk to you about the workflows of how and where you can use SQL in sort of your workflow, your day-to-day workflow when working with data. So generally, if you're working with data, data can come from all sorts of places, but generally you're working to accomplish one of two things. Maybe there may be other ones, but generally what I've seen is you're either working with the data to analyze and reduce the data for reporting, or you're analyzing the data for insight. Maybe a subset under that is maybe you're doing some statistical modeling to take the data and then make a prediction in the future based on the data that you have. And that's, again, part of the insight. So generally I see that when you're working with data, you're trying to do one of two things: reduce the data for reporting or analyzing the data for insight. Now, knowing that, getting the information that you want requires you to think backwards. And this is important because what you want out of the database is going to affect the query that you write. And the complexity or the simplicity of the query is going to depend on the question that you want answered or the data that you want to get from the database. Now, generally when you work with data, you want to ask very pointed questions, and that's a separate discussion. But generally when you're working with a database or you're working with data, you're asking questions and then you're going into the data to find answers for those questions. And like I said, I'm not going to go into the process of asking pointed questions or what is a good question or a bad question to ask when it comes to data. I'm just going to leave that there. All I want you to know is that getting the information that you want from the SQL database requires you to think backwards. And so in order to think backwards, let me just show you what the overall workflow is when it comes to data analytics. So when it comes to data analytics or working with data, you generally identify a problem that you want answered or solved with data. You then proceed to obtain the data for that problem. You tend to process or clean the data that you'll get. And data is very dirty. It requires a lot of cleaning. Real world data requires a lot of cleaning. So this is a very important step. Once you have clean data, you analyze the data and then you present the data. Interestingly enough, a lot of the time is spent in this part of the process, obtaining the data and processing the data. It doesn't matter what technology you're using, what industry you're in. When you're working with data, these are the two areas that you will spend most of your time in. So the textbook example of this is that you need to prepare a report for your boss or the agency. And so you identify the problem. I have to prepare XYZ report to submit for this agency. You proceed to say, okay, what data do I need to prepare that report? You get the data. You then clean the data to be sure that it's okay, it makes sense, there's no anomalies, because what you'll find is that if you analyze really bad data, you get a bad output. So garbage in is garbage out. So you want to process the data and clean the data. You want to analyze the data to be sure that what calculations or conclusions you arrive to make sense, and then you want to present the data to the stakeholder, if that's your boss or the agency or a client or whatever. So that's generally how you proceed through any data problem, or this is called the data analytics workflow. And what you'll find is that when it comes to SQL sits generally at these two steps here. There may be some overlap with the first and the fourth step, but generally SQL is used to obtain the data and sort of process the data to a certain extent. You can do some analysis of the data, but generally it's used to obtain and process the data. And so this is where SQL is going to fit. And so the way that you write SQL queries to obtain the data really depends on the problem that you have and how you're going to analyze the data, and then ultimately how you are going to present the data. And so you have to know this 5-step workflow, because if you just start writing queries without context, then it is possible that you could write queries that the worst part is that the query will work and you'll get data out of it, but the data may not fit the context, or may not be actually solving the problem that you sought out to solve. And so you really have to look at things on a very high level so that you understand how to write your queries, how to obtain the data, how to process the data within the context of SQL. And the only way to do that efficiently or properly is to look at the big picture and then start working backwards. Again, what problem do I have? What data do I want to present? What analyses do I want to run? And then once you know those things, then you come down to writing precisely queries to get precisely what you want from your SQL database. And so that's a very big picture way of thinking of things, but it's very important. It's very important because SQL queries can be very simple or they can be very complex, and they can be frustrating to debug. And if you don't have context or a map of where you're going or how you're going to get from A to B, it could be like a never-ending battle with it. And at that point, a lot of people do give up on it. And so, just do remember that. Keep this workflow in mind because it's going to affect your SQL query. So with that, I just want to show you this last slide before we jump into the live coding section. But this is just, we're going to jump into the live coding section. The toy database that we're going to be using is from the MySQL website. It's called the Sakila database. It's been a toy database from MySQL for a very long time, and it is a toy database representing DVD sales from 2 stores. And you can see here that there are a good amount of tables in here, more than 10. And what we'll do is we will go through the syntax of writing a select statement, or writing queries and crafting more complicated queries based on questions and our data analytics workflow that we had in the past. And so what you can see here is this is a little preview here. Every query starts with a select statement. It's select from limit or select from where, and then what you have after these keywords, it depends on what you're trying to do. But that is the general structure of a select statement. That is the standard structure of a select statement regardless of what dialect you're in. There is always a select statement, and it's select from where, limit, and from there things can get more elaborate or more complicated as the use case changes. And so with that, that's the end of section 2 of this seminar. I'll see you in section 3. We'll be jumping into the Sakila database, and I'll be live coding and actually pulling data out of this database and for you live. So I'll see you there.